Just recently, Armenia and Azerbaijan were at war with each other. Thousands of people were killed, both soldiers and civilians on both sides. Who were the two major players that got involved in that conflict? It was not the United States. It was not France either. Because remember, when Armenia and Azerbaijan were at war the last time there was a major war between the two, the French, the Americans, and the Russians got together and they formed a group called the Minsk Group. And the whole purpose of the Minsk Group is to make sure that the Armenians and the Azeris don't kill each other. So when the Armenians and the Azeris were at war just a number of months ago, the Americans did not get involved. The French, they had some things to say, but they didn't really get involved in a major or substantial capacity. It was the Russians and the Turks who did the intervention. The Turks got involved by, as you all know, giving the Azeris some serious drone weaponry. And also, before the war broke out, the Turks were doing joint coalition training sessions with the Azeris. So there was some serious training that came in with Turkey's backing of the Azeris. The Russians got involved by single-handedly brokering the ceasefire, and also by deploying nearly 2,000 Russian soldiers into Nagorno-Karabakh, which has been the center of contention and battle and war between the Azeris and the Armenians. But the Americans did not get involved this time. They did not get involved. Why not? Well, the Americans have been distracted by two things. Distracted by coronavirus, occupied by coronavirus, I should say, and also occupied by the controversy of the U.S. election. So the Americans are tied up. They are tied up. Plus, the American people, for the most part, are not interested in getting involved in wars. They are not interested in America being the police officer, the global police officer for the world. If the Armenians and the Azeris are killing each other, that's their problem. Let them handle that. It's not our job. This has become a mainstream mentality amongst the American population. So, what does this indicate to us? There was a power vacuum in the midst of this conflict, and it was filled by the Turks and the Russians. The American empire, as we have known it, is declining. It is going down. Which leads me to something very interesting that I found out in the wee hours of the morning, because sometimes I like to stay up late and read things, and there's something very bittersweet about staying up and reading and writing. I don't know. Maybe it's just the artist in me, but there's something about the night that just pumps up those creative juices in the brain. So there's some interesting things that I would like to talk about in regards to this. The Germans, for a long time, have known that sooner or later, the American empire is going to decline. There is a major German political advisor by the name of Werner Weidenfeld. And Werner Weidenfeld has been an advisor for decades and decades for numerous German governments. He was an advisor for the infamous Helmut Kohl decades and decades ago. And today he continues to push for certain ideas and certain policies for the German government. And one of the things that he wants to see is a pan-European military force. Of course, this pan-European military force will be led by Germany, because Germany is the biggest economy in the EU, and Germany is the biggest powerhouse within the European Union. France is the second biggest economy within the European Union. I think it used to be the third. Now that Britain is leaving, France is going to be number 2. But the French don't do anything without Germany's approval, because the Germans are the biggest dog in the Euro bloc. So if the Europeans are going to start a pan-European military force, they are going to do so with the intentions of being independent of the United States. In other words, they want to undermine the American global security blanket, the global security umbrella that the United States has established, going all the way back to when the Americans were the big victors in the Second World War. And so the EU, which is led by Germany for the most part, the EU wants to make its own military force. And make no mistake, this will be, if it forms, this will be a pan-European military force. It essentially will be a German military confederacy, German-led military confederacy. And the Germans will be the most powerful within this pan-European military force, and everyone else, all the other armies, all the other European militaries will simply be the auxiliary forces for this German empire, because that's essentially what it would be. The EU is essentially the continuation of German power. It's the continuation of German empire. Even before the creation of the euro, it was the German mark that dominated the economy of Europe. It was the German mark that determined the value of other European currencies. And the precursor to the EU, which was the European Monetary Union. When the British joined that, because the British pound had to be pinned to the mark, that led to all sorts of manipulation. George Soros was involved in that, and the pound just went right to hell. And it really goes to show you that even though the Germans lost the war, the Americans said, okay, we know that you're very, very powerful and dangerous, but we want to keep you controlled and at the same time satisfied, so we're going to allow you to become this big major economy, and this big major economy is going to lead its European neighbors. So the Europeans, the Germans, they know that they can become a major global superpower. They are one of the biggest economies in the world. They have the biggest free trade centers, free trade zones in the world, and they definitely have the capabilities to do that. Going back to this Werner Weidenfeld guy, this guy says that the EU, because it has this economic power, it has the capacity to becoming a military power. And back in 2007, Weidenfeld stated that the American global hegemony is going to decline. This is what he wrote back in 2007. The United States' unipolar moment is passing. With the rise of China and India, the future multipolar world order is taking shape. And that is what we are seeing. We're seeing the rise of other power players filling up vacuums that the United States would otherwise be filling, and the Americans aren't, because the American empire is losing morale. It's losing its enthusiasm. And so you have all these power vacuums that are being filled either by the Turks, by the Russians, by the Germans. And so we are seeing the rise of regional powers growing to revive or pursuing the revival of their former selves, pursuing the revival of their past empires. That is what we are seeing. So I thought this was quite interesting. And when I read this, I thought, wow, this is interesting. Back in 2007, the Germans were already talking about this, the decline of the American empire, and essentially what would happen with this decline. And we are seeing this. We are seeing this manifesting right before our eyes. Russia advancing its position in the South Caucasus, the Turks doing the same thing. And in fact, the Russians putting nearly 2,000 troops in Nagorno-Karabakh, which is technically within Azerbaijan, that is no small matter. That is a huge deal. That's essentially Russia expanding its military presence. That's what's happening. The Russians aren't just, oh, we're just going to, they're not saying, oh, we're just going to put some troops there and that's it. No. They are building permanent military bases there. There is a quote, actually, from a former Azerbaijani intelligence officer. His name is Arastun Oruclu. And he says, quote, "There has never been a Russian force in Azerbaijan since the fall of the Soviet Union. They aren't just a ceasefire mission. They have heavy weaponry. They are building permanent military bases that have drones and everything. Russian influence in the region and Azerbaijan will be directly felt." So the Russians, and according to the plan, the Russian military is going to be there for the next 5 years. And then after those 5 years are up, they will renew that 5-year stay unless one of the parties, either Azerbaijan or Armenia or both, refuses or expresses their disapproval of having these Russian soldiers within 6 months. But if that doesn't happen, then the Russians will stay there for another 5 years. But I think that if nothing happens to somehow impede Russia's military presence within these next 5 years, I think something big will probably happen to try to prevent Russia from staying another 5 years in that area. But it reminds me, like, putting soldiers in an area in the name of peacekeeping, but in reality, like, you just want to just take over land and territory. It reminds me of what the Japanese did. There's two examples that I can think of. One, after the during the Boxer Rebellion, Chinese nationalists were butchering British people and they were killing Christians and anything that they perceived as foreign. During the Boxer Rebellion, there was a Japanese ambassador who was murdered by Chinese Muslim thugs, and the Japanese, as a response, sent a bunch of soldiers into China in the name of protecting their officials who were in China. And they were sticking around. They weren't planning on leaving because the Japanese wanted to control China. And remember, before the Boxer Rebellion, the Chinese and the Japanese had a war, and the Japanese wanted to control China. It's the same reason why the Japanese want to control Korea. Korea is the pathway into China. You control China, then it's a pathway to a whole bunch of other lands. And there's a whole bunch of resources in China that a lot of people want to control as well. So the Japanese weren't leaving, and then the Russians told the Japanese to leave, and the Japanese refused, and eventually the Russians and the Japs had a war. The Japanese and the Russians had a war. It's called the First Russo-Japanese War, which the Russians lost. And that was in 1904, and it ended in 1905. And then there's another example in after World War I. There was the Russian Civil War between the Bolsheviks, the Red Army, and the White Army. The White Army were the anti-communist Russian fighters, and the victors of World War I decided to intervene. And so the Americans sent troops into Russia, and the Japanese decided to send troops into Russia. And the Japanese sent the largest number of troops into Russia. The Japanese sent around 70,000 Japanese soldiers into Russia. And it was like, okay, well, how long are you going to be staying here? Turned out the Japanese were more interested in taking territory from Russia that they believed, that the Japanese believed belonged to them, than they were actually fighting communism. The Japanese were interested in taking the Sakhalin region, which to this day the Japanese and Russians are arguing over. The Russians control Sakhalin, but the Japanese still believe it belongs to them. So when you see a country like Russia putting all these soldiers into one area, and it's in the name of peacekeeping, there's other motivations involved. This is about expanding power. This is about reviving empire. That is the bottom line. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.